has been about this, not ships, but supply chain. And investing into, so I'm an entrepreneur, investor, run a VC fund. But the typical reaction I get when I say this is something like this. People, on the one hand, find it tremendously boring, and number two, typically don't really understand really what is it for and why do we need them and what is the kind of impact that they have. So next 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to try and convince you why it's really important and why we have the opportunity to save hundreds of millions of lives in improving our supply chains and why they're so important for our sustainability. I have a lot of slides, so we're going to go at a fast clip. So this picture here is from a hunter-gatherer society. This is how we used to live 10, 20,000, 100,000 years ago. And the planet can sustain something like 1 million, 10 million, maybe 100 million, depending who you ask, in terms of food supplies, in terms of ecosystems. The problem is that today we are upwards of 8 billion people on the globe, and there is no way of getting around specialization, trade, and a supply chain that goes underneath all of this. A really good example of that is the way that our artery system works. So we have organs that specialize, and we have a distribution network. And if the distribution network doesn't work, well, then parts of our body will not work as they're supposed to. If you look at the magnitude of the supply chain, then the supply chain essentially is distributing somewhere beyond 10 billion tons of goods, upwards of a value of $20 trillion. What is less known is that it is a fairly arcane industry. So if you look at US manufacturers, for example, they are managing their own artery systems, if you will, out of spreadsheets. Mind-boggling considering where technology is today, but that is the current situation of the global supply chain. So what's relevant here? How do we look and try and address this problem? So my personal view, but it's my own guess, is that 1 billion people are going to have a really, really big problem in the next decade if we don't do something about this. And we're going to talk about 3 things. There are lots of things that are important here, but I will talk about 3 things that I think are particularly important right now. So the first one is, what can we really do in this global supply chain? The second one is going to be equality across the globe, because we are people and everyone in this room is very fortunate to have the things that they would like to have. But there's about 4 billion people in the world that don't have what we have. And the last thing is the supply chain in itself is causing an impact to sustainability and progress. So there are things that we need to deal with. I'm just going to take a few examples first. They're not going to be fantastically fun to look at. After that, I promise we're going to look at some things that are slightly more positive and some pathways to actually solving this. So if we take, that was the wrong direction. If we take capability first, the COVID is a great example. So you have a few locations that are producing a vaccine. Now you need to distribute it to billions of people. And some of these supply chains are tremendously complex. Some of the vaccines require perfect supply chains that keep the vaccine below minus 70 degrees centigrade. That is really, really difficult. And what it means is it's going to take us years before we are able to distribute it. Even if we have the production capability, it will mean that millions of people are going to die in the process. And this by most estimates, is a very mild pandemic. What if you had a much more violent pandemic? Imagine the capability that you would have to actually solve this problem. If we look at problems like situations where all of a sudden you have locust infestations, other similar things where all of a sudden in a very short time span you have a situation you need to be able to supply food, basic necessities in a very short period of time. We don't today have that capability. Again, millions die because we can't actually do that. If you look at the other picture, then this is causing people to migrate. When you compound it with all sorts of other issues like climate change, then it just increases the number. Some people believe that in this decade we're going to have 1 billion people who are just going to be wandering the planet, and they have no access to any basic necessities. I don't know if that is a correct number, but I think that it's fairly clear that we are going to face hundreds of millions of people in that situation. And the importance of that is that now we don't only need to supply things very fast, we need to be very agile in how we supply them, because we don't know where these people are going to be and how we can help them. Again, a situation where hundreds of millions of people are going to be maimed, or in a situation where they might find a fatal situation. The last one I'll touch on capability is sometimes we have situations where stuff just disappears overnight. You have storms, superstorms, you have typhoons. You might have had a good infrastructure, you might have had a good transportation system, but it just disappeared. And now you have to have immediate, fast emergency supply chains overnight to be able to actually overcome this problem. And until you do that, you have people who are going to be stuck without food, electricity, anything that they need to sustain themselves. And if we look at most reports globally, this is not going to change. This is going to get worse. We're going to have rising sea levels, except if you are a radical, Republican in the US, then you might have a different opinion. But most of us, I think, are looking at it and believing that this is probably what we're facing. So that requires a tremendous amount of innovation to solve. If we look at equality, then you can look at the ship here on this side, or this side, or here. That's a really big container ship. It carries more than 10,000 containers. The other one is a small one. It carries something like 500 containers. You will also note that the small one has key cranes on the ship because the infrastructure in where it's going, in this case Papua New Guinea, is not there to actually have that infrastructure. Now this means that the freight that we're dealing with is 10x more expensive, and that's maybe not so important if you're transporting cell phones or laptops, but if you are dealing with what the early development countries are dealing with, which are commodities, basic textiles, this is somewhere upwards of 50% of the cost of what it takes to export or import a good. So you are at a massive disadvantage compared to developing countries in terms of supply chains. We also have situations where we have places we can't get to. Yemen, perfect example. We can't actually get to places in Yemen, which is one of the biggest humanitarian crises that we're facing globally, because to do that, we would have to put people in harm's way. Now, If we had had situations where we didn't do that, like autonomous supply chains, situation would be completely different. But we don't have it today. And so because we don't have it today, and don't Google this, because if you Google it, you will see some really horrible pictures. I tried to find one that was not that horrible, but it's clearly like an extreme example of where we find inequality in the world. If we look at sustainability, then I think most people in this room know that there is a tremendous amount of food waste going on globally. This particular source suggests that we're wasting something to the value of $1 trillion a year. What is not so well known is that upwards of 50% of that waste happens in the supply chain. Now, 50% of that waste is enough to feed everyone who is facing hunger in the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the mechanism and that's how it works. It simply gives us an idea of the magnitude of the kind of waste that is going on. If we look at another example of it, of course, the supply chain itself is also a contributor to, let's say, sustainability, or the other side of it, which is, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions. So there are a number of estimates out there that suggest that we will be doing something like 3 billion tons of CO2 emissions in the next few decades, if we are talking about fossil fuels themselves, just out of ship operations. If you talk about all the steel, all the concrete that's required to build infrastructure in and around supply chain, the number is much bigger. It's probably 3x, it might be an order of magnitude, it might be even bigger. So we have also this challenge where we need it, but we need to make it sustainable. Now, that was all a bit of a bummer, and I'm sorry for that. I didn't try to ruin your evening. Now, let me try and move on to where some of this hope comes from and why I'm in here and spending my time on it. So I'll touch on a few things. The one thing is that the governments are waking up. They're starting to understand the dynamics in between. Why do we need the specialization? Why do we need to have investments going into the field? Why do we need entrepreneurs? Why do we need corporations coming into it? And up here we have governments going in. This one here, particular quote, was actually prior to the COVID. Ban Ki-moon came out and said we need somewhere close to $2 trillion to solve infrastructure globally just because of climate change. Lots of that was related to transport infrastructure. The other part is private capital is going in a major way. So if you're looking at venture capital, we're somewhere an order of magnitude higher than the average. If you look at giants like SoftBank, BlackRock, they're going in very hard. And so it means that when you look across VC, CVC, private equity, any quasi kind of instrument in between them, lots and lots of capital is going in very fast. And part of the reason of that is, you look personally, right? If you're a family, could you avoid going on a cruise ship? You probably could, right? You don't necessarily need to go on a cruise ship, but you do need your toilet paper. And so there are things you can do within, and there's things that you can do without, and the supply chains are essential. And yeah, I know I'm over time. I have 30 seconds left. So no worries on that. So we think that more than $1 trillion is right now being allocated into this place. More than 10,000 entrepreneurs and tech companies are going into this space, and the sentiment is changing very fast on how important this is. This goes anywhere from vertical farming in a container, sustainable energy in a container, to 3D printing in a container, which means now we don't just need to get the basic commodities, necessities to these places. We can actually give them the capabilities in a very versatile way and help them. There are other examples like autonomous shipping. If we'd had autonomous shipping by now, we could have had it. We would not have seen the disruptions. We would have saved millions of lives. But we don't. And we need to innovate fast. I'll skip the other side since I've been prompted on being over time. The last one I'll mention here is, this is a drone that's developed by the military in the US that can come out of a container. And so you don't actually know whether you have thousands of killer drones coming into a port near you. And that means we also need oversight. We need oversight on understanding how this is innovating and avoiding these kind of situations. So the last thing I just want to put out there before I get kicked off the stage by Oscar is, so when you see a ship or when you see something similar, I prefer if you have that reaction, because the reality is really that there's no better time to come into this and be part of it. We can save millions of people, we can make the planet more sustainable, and there's enough technology out there that can be applied. Investors are going in like crazy. So I'd really invite all of, anyone interested in being an entrepreneur, innovating, being in a company who wants to innovate and make the world more sustainable, to join me, thousands of others in entrepreneurship, to come in and tackle this problem. Thank you.